Hello and welcome to the Full Scottish here on Broadcasting Scotland. My name's Kenny McBride and I'm joined today by two excellent guests. First on this side by Anthony Salamone, who is a political analyst at European Merchants. Anthony, how are you this morning?
Fine, Kenny. How are you?
I'm very well. And on the other side of me, South Scotland MSP Emma Harper. Emma, how are you today?
I'm good, thanks, from Bonnie Galloway. It's great.
Grand. Well, we start as we always do with our quick coronavirus statistics update. These statistics are as of yesterday afternoon. As we know, today's statistics won't be published for another couple of hours yet. But as of yesterday, a total of 228,083 people in Scotland have been tested. Of those, 209,953 were confirmed negative and 18,130 tests were positive. Last night, which of course was Friday night, there were 519 people in hospital, 7 of whom were in intensive care and another 7 with suspected COVID-19 in intensive care. And so far, 2,472 patients who tested positive have now sadly died from their illness. And again, we just stress that number does only include those who have died in hospital, having received a positive test for the virus. The total number now is just slightly over 4,000. So that's where we stand just now. But the big thing that's been happening this week has been a series of protests and counter-protests happening, particularly in George Square. This week we saw, an asylum seekers protest over evictions, which was then met by what appeared to be a gang of loyalist thugs, calling themselves the National Defence League. There was then a further protest at the weekend where, again, another group of thugs, again, apparently the National Defence League, whatever that may be, and the police got very heavily involved. There was some discussion about whether the police had taken the right kind of action. There was also discussion about the Police Federation's comments earlier in the week about the two different groups of people that were in George Square. And Emma, if I could come to you first, what was your reaction to seeing these thugs attacking protesters under the guise of being there to protect statues?
I think, actually, Kenny, you are right to call them thugs. I think there is a difference between peaceful protesters that are trying to convey a message of racial inequality. And for me personally, I support Black Lives Matters. I think it's really important that we need to challenge police brutality and deal with any violence or non-peaceful protest in a way that we need to be dealing with it, potentially strongly. But ultimately, the message of Black Lives Matters is the one for me is really important. I lived in Los Angeles when Rodney King was assaulted, brutally assaulted, and all 4 police officers were acquitted. So I was out in Los Angeles during that time, and we saw every day on the news police brutality that was happening, and now we're seeing that this emotion has spread across the globe, and I think it's quite right that we raise awareness of inequality with people of ethnic minority, and I will do whatever I can to support them.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, this is various people have tried to kind of explain some of these things, because this has happened in London as well. There have been similar things happened in the States as well. And it's been explained as people standing guard to protect statues. I mean, I'm not sure how anyone would manage to bring down any of the statues in George Square. But there's, what do you think the real reason is this? I mean, people have also suggested that, it's just people who've been locked up in the house all full of testosterone and they need an outlet for their aggressions. What do you make of some of these excuses or reasons that have been given for why some people are engaging in these violent counter-protests?
Well, I'd start by echoing everything that Emma said. I mean, peaceful protest is a cornerstone of democracy. Of course, this is a challenging time to be organizing a protest that's safe considering the coronavirus. But peaceful protest is crucial, particularly when there are such important issues that are on the public mind. But in terms of these counter protesters protecting statues or whatever else they're trying to do, it's clear that that's wrong. That there are a number of different kinds of layers of messages, which might be anti-immigrant in nature, for instance, or fearful or resistant to social progress. And I think we probably could all disagree with that. At the same time, I think it's important to take a broader perspective to recognize that the only way to move forward as a society is to find some way for those people to come on board with the rest of us in moving forward. And that requires them to see the light in some respects and to evolve as persons. And largely that is up to them, of course. But I think that aspect, has to be part of the conversation as we move forward beyond the coronavirus pandemic. And thinking about how we create a society where people don't follow that path of being so angry and indeed violent, because obviously that's unacceptable. And thinking about how we can do things better.
Mm-hmm. And Emma, this does seem to be tied up in some ways with loyalism in Scotland, which has always kind of been there. We've had the Orange Order for many years, and a lot of people have objected to that. But generally, those marches are relatively peaceful. Obviously, in recent years there have been some bits and bobs of unpleasantness, but generally, not law-abiding. Now, there's also the kind of Nazi salutes. Now, we saw those as far back as the 19th of September 2014, and we're seeing them again from these loyalists, people just trying to wrap themselves in the British flag, and then perpetrating acts of violence and public disorder. Is there something that we need to talk about regarding the violence and the rhetoric, perhaps, of unionists and loyalists in Scotland?
Yeah, I've seen a few discussions already that are trying to dissect what unionists, loyalists, how we need to maybe change that language. For me, we had First Minister and Hamza Yousaf and Amar Anwar promote digital protests. So they were not suggesting that people go out and protest on the street, but do a safe approach, which is what Anthony actually mentioned as well. It's really difficult to go out and protest during the time of a pandemic when we're supposed to be socially distancing and protecting from each other. These other groups that are going out, that the loyalists and standing to protect statues in George Square, it may be an excuse just to get out and shout about what you think is being affected, and let's wrap ourselves in union flags. For me, we want to oppose what the message of Brexit is, which is send all the Europeans away. We don't want foreigners in the country. In Scotland, we're taking a different direction. And I think as we're seeing the pandemic bringing people onto the street to argue, there is a difference between peaceful protest and then these other protesters. And, we for me in Scotland, we want to promote this whole welcoming of people, and so that we can show that Scotland can take a different approach and have a more inclusive approach. And the loyalists and the loyalist unionists, however we take apart that language, they need to be the ones that we are othering, and we need to be welcoming everybody else.
And Anthony, just quite quickly, the whole Brexit debate, and in many ways it goes back decades, but obviously it reached a fever pitch in the last couple of years. How much do you think that has had an impact on either the prevalence of racism in the country, or perhaps the ability of people to voice their racism?
Well, I think that Brexit has undoubtedly had an impact by the kinds of messages which the UK government, through its pursuit of Brexit and the way in which it has pursued Brexit, has facilitated, if not fostered, a culture of leaving the European Union, of walking away from the ideals of the European Union, and embracing a much more right-wing message, which is frankly hostile to immigration from almost anywhere, but including the European Union. And that that may tip some people over the edge of feeling it's acceptable to express views which are very distasteful. So yes, Brexit certainly plays a role, but that goes to show that, of course, that leadership matters, or the lack of leadership can matter. Good leadership from politicians helps foster a culture where people are respectful of one another, and then either poor leadership or no leadership can lead to that kind of social responsibility disintegrating. And there's a big contrast between the approach of the Scottish government, which is much more positive and respectful, versus the UK government's approach, which is pro-Brexit and fairly right wing, and committed to taking forward those kinds of projects.
Yeah. Well, speaking of political leadership, we turn our eyes across the Atlantic, and leadership, as Anthony said, it can be good, it can be bad. But before we do, just a wee reminder, you will have seen some tweets coming up on the screen there. You can join us using the hashtag #FoolScottish. We'd love to hear what you've got to say. So do please tweet in and let us know what you think about all the issues we're discussing today. But Donald Trump this weekend has managed to get rid of Geoffrey Berman, the southern prosecutor in the Southern District of New York, one of the most powerful prosecutors in the country. He had been investigating and had prosecuted some of Trump's allies. Some of people close to Trump was said to be investigating others. Obviously, we're not privy to the inner workings of his office. His resignation was announced on Friday, and then he said, "No, I've not resigned." He was then apparently fired by Attorney General Bill Barr, and he then announced his resignation shortly after that. So, Emma, I'll come to you first on this. What do you make of Donald Trump's continual kind of blurring of the lines of kind of what's appropriate behavior by a president, particularly when it comes to his dealings with the justice system?
Well, Donald Trump is, an interesting subject, I'm sure, for everybody at the moment. And I've seen lots of comments on Twitter, and it exasperates me how the president of the United States can behave or act or tweet in a certain way. Maybe questions are better for Anthony to be directed, because I am frustrated about how much we put an emphasis on Donald Trump and his behavior when we've got leadership in Europe that we need to be working with as we move forward. My biggest concerns are Donald Trump and the potential for a cheap Trump trade deal when we are negotiating our relationship in the future. As far as his whole behavior, I'm concerned of how he's handled this pandemic. I'm concerned about how he handled the issues of George Floyd's murder, which led to Black Lives Matter riots. And I'm also concerned about what I've just talked about, the cheap Trump trade deals, because it's some of the work that I'm doing as a South Scotland and rural MSP is looking at animal welfare and the welfare of the produce that's going to come into our country. But I would defer to Anthony for specific issues around how he's dealing with the courts and legal systems and firing people.
Yeah, Anthony, did you have any thoughts about this weird firing that's happened?
Well, I think we've reached the stage where anything that Donald Trump does is not really surprising. He seems to descend ever further to depths of breaking new ground of doing things which are reprehensible. This seems like a complex case. It seems that this prosecutor, Berman, originally worked for Trump for a short time, worked with Rudy Giuliani, who is or was close to Donald Trump, and so on. So it seems confusing. This role is important because this is the federal prosecutor that covers New York City, and so therefore is responsible, for instance, for federal crimes related to finance in New York City and so on. So that's why this post is high profile. Obviously, I think the most important question, other than the personalities, is whatever cases this prosecutor is covering. That needs to be the focus of that person's attention, and we need a competent prosecutor who's able to take us forward, because this is obviously a crucial time, not least because of the economic and financial response to the pandemic. It's important that someone is holding huge multinational corporations based in New York City to account in the kinds of activities they are doing or not doing. So on that basis, sure. But in terms of Donald Trump himself, it was, to me, always the case, but it seems increasingly difficult to believe that Donald Trump cares much about anything other than himself, or indeed his re-election prospects. And that includes the American public and the functioning of democracy, to be quite honest. But this is nothing new. I suppose the key question on that is, how does it affect the upcoming election, which, is meant to take place in November? Clearly, despite all of this, Trump's base seems to still support him, and they always have. But that's not what matters. What matters are swing voters or former Democratic voters in key swing states, like Pennsylvania. Well, Pennsylvania wasn't a swing state, but Donald Trump made it one, or Missouri or Florida. And if those people have reached the tipping point of realizing that supporting Donald Trump is not for them, then Joe Biden may well be in contention to beat Trump in November.
Yeah. Well, Trump did try to rally his troops this weekend. He announced a rally in Tulsa, and amazingly, and this is one of the best pieces of digital activism I think I've ever seen, a whole bunch of people on TikTok especially decided to apply for tickets, and so they were announcing, this is amazing, it's going to be a huge rally, over 1 million people have applied for tickets, and then only 10,000 turned up because so many people had applied for tickets without ever intending to go. But at the rally, Trump did a couple of interesting things. He said that he had told his people to slow down the amount of testing they were doing, because the amount of testing they were doing for COVID-19 was bringing up more and more cases, and he wanted to lower the number of cases that he was announcing. What do you make of this kind of leadership? I mean, this is the man who once said he could walk down Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and it wouldn't affect his poll ratings. Here he is literally telling people, well, I didn't care how many people died as long as my numbers looked good. What do you make of that, Anthony?
Well, it's really hard to take that seriously or believe that he cares about anyone other than himself. First of all, it's highly irresponsible for a politician to be holding a major political rally in the midst of the worst global pandemic that we can remember. But beyond that, he's not a leader, in my view. He is a follower and someone who clearly has a very thin skin, who can't seem to grasp the totality of the responsibility of leadership, particularly being the president of the United States. It's really hard to list decisions that he's made in any respect which have either made sense or been positive. But of course, it's important to remember that the United States is a federal system, that power is spread across many different kinds of institutions, and that is probably what has saved the United States from the crisis being even worse. So that's to say that at the federal level, obviously Congress and the courts have powers too, but public health is largely the responsibility of the states. And of course, the states have taken much more decisive action, and indeed local authorities as well, to combat the pandemic. But again, that's also been mixed. Some states who with governments that are more close to Trump have, for instance, been much more lax in either imposing or not imposing lockdowns and so on. And obviously, this is not a thing that should be tied to politics. It's based on public health. But many other states have pursued what they think is best, regardless of what the president says.
Yeah. Well, speaking of lockdown and its impact, we come back to this side of the Atlantic, and the NRS reported amongst their statistics that they published this week the fact that people in the lowest socioeconomic groups are twice as likely to die from COVID-19 as those in the highest groups. Emma, when you look at numbers like that, what does it tell you as a politician that you need to be working on?
It concerns me when we see the numbers of, I guess, the issues around equality and how lockdown has affected different people. And, I'm a member of the Racial Equality Cross-Party Group and the Health Inequality Cross-Party Group in Parliament. So even outside COVID, we look at health implications and inequalities. But now that we're seeing what's happening with the coronavirus and statistics that are being, I guess, being printed, it's a concern that obviously myself and my colleagues in Parliament and then government need to obviously be addressing where we can the issues to tackle poverty and support a better equality. I know one of the talking points that has come up has been the universal basic income, and First Minister has said that she is now more convinced that it's something we can continue to look at and pursue. And we know we've got trials in Scotland with universal basic income, and we're looking at other countries as well, and that would be one way to look at how we can support moving forward a better equal society.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at the actual lockdown itself, I mean, is there a concern maybe that the longer lockdown goes on, the worse the inequality becomes? I mean, clearly people who are on very insecure work are being hit hardest by the loss of an income. People who are already, unhealthy are having their health worse affected. People who are perhaps have less educational advantages are missing school more than people who have a lot of maybe educational opportunities outside of school. Is there maybe more that the Scottish Government needs to be doing right now to help with those issues?
Well, I raised an issue actually this week with the Cabinet Secretary John Swinney about digital access for children who are, learning at home, because of local casework that has came to me, and there are many families across certain parts of the Dumfries, for instance, and even Stranraer, where the families don't even have access to the internet or enough to be able to help support their own kids at school. So I raised that with the Cabinet Secretary John Swinney this week to see what we can do. And I'm aware of programmes that have been brought forward in England where BT have been able to offer 6 months free internet for children that, based on a voucher system, for those families that don't have access to internet. So there is things that we can do, and there is stuff that we are doing that we're trying to make that people in areas of lower income or higher deprivation, that are classed as higher deprivation, that we can help support families that are maybe missing out.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, coming to you now. This is the question of kind of poverty and inequality and these kind of things has obviously come to the fore during this pandemic. I think, like a lot of other issues, it's kind of highlighted some of the problems that kind of underlie a lot of things going on in society. What has struck you most about how the virus, the pandemic, and lockdown has affected different groups differently?
Well, I think the inequality is probably one of, if not the defining issue of our times. And as you said, many of these inequalities that people face are certainly not new, and they were never right, but they have been exposed. And I think one of the most notable things is that there seems to be a very welcome change in culture to say that maybe the way that we did things before wasn't acceptable, and it's time for us to try to do different things. And as I say, that's welcome, because it's clear that our society can be structured differently, can function differently. Wealth can be distributed in a way which is more equitable, and ensures that more people have more opportunities to lead a better, healthier life, and to find fulfillment through study or work or whatever else suits them. That matters about creating a society where life is better for more people. I really hope that culture shift continues and develops and translates into things that are real, because obviously we're starting to think about how can we have an economic recovery, and there are choices about how to do that, and I hope that we make better ones, particularly from the last crisis. Of course, if you contrast everything with the economic and financial crisis, keeping in mind that many people never really came out of that crisis to begin with. But the differences in terms of the policy response then, which was we're going to bail banks out and then we need austerity for a very long time, versus the kind of responses we've seen this time, much more positive about we actually can borrow money and we can actually use it to spend things that we need for things that we need. That proves that there was always a choice. And it's time to think about that.
And when you look at the politics of the situation, I mean, we have Boris Johnson claiming that child poverty has declined when it's risen. You have him not even knowing what no recourse to public funds means. Do you get any feeling that there's going to be different decisions made at Westminster or indeed at Holyrood for the decisions that can be made here? Do you get the feeling that there is going to be any different kind of response this time around?
Well, I think Boris Johnson's relationship with the truth is challenged, as is for Donald Trump. But I think when it comes to Westminster, I don't have a great expectation that the UK government is going to be leading the charge to be creating a new progressive society. But I do think it's perfectly possible that Westminster could be influenced by what other countries do. And I also think that, for instance, the coronavirus jobs retention scheme and so on, I think that was definitely influenced by what other countries in Europe were doing. When Germany were announcing that they were spending hundreds of billions of euros, there was big pressure put on the UK government indirectly to really, actually, we need to do this as well, rather than thinking from the beginning that what can we do best using the levers of the state. So I think that whatever the UK government does, it will do so as a consequence of peer pressure from other states. In terms of the Scottish government and the Scottish Parliament, well, obviously there are limits of devolution as to what is possible, not least that so many aspects of tax and spend and obviously benefits are reserved. So that begs the question of how do we move forward? And obviously under independence, the Scottish Parliament would be able to do whatever it would thought best. More powers could be transferred to the Scottish Parliament, but I think that seems unlikely because Boris Johnson, through his actions, is clearly not that interested in devolution or protecting the powers of the Scottish Parliament. So I think that obviously Scotland is constrained, but I hope that there are things that can still be done to try and think about making it a more equitable society.
Mm-hmm. Now we move on to something that I'm sure Emma will have something quite a lot to say about. This week we saw guidance published by the Scottish Government on restarting tourism in Scotland. This is one of obviously Scotland's most important industries, and it's one that has been hit extremely hard by the pandemic. People have not been leaving the house, so they've not been going to restaurants and hotels, not been going anywhere. Nobody's visiting museums. Nobody's doing any of the things that the tourism sector does so well in Scotland. And I think probably in a lot of ways this affects rural areas worse than it does the cities, like where I am just now, Emma. What's been your response in your constituency to how tourism and the rural economy has been affected by the pandemic?
It's been completely affected. We saw this morning that Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewan was on Gordon Brewer talking specifically about tourism and reopening. And we have people in my area in Dumfries and Galloway, for instance, in the southwest, just champing at the bit to get on with it and open up the bed and breakfast, the hotels, the visitor attractions, and we've got many outdoor attractions as well. Tourism in Dumfries and Galloway is huge, but what I'm in support of, and I generally think that the businesses are in support of, is the July 15th as the opening date, and to restart, and that gives the businesses time to prepare. And a lot of my contact from businesses like wee cafes that have outside space, and many of them will find it really difficult adhering to 2 meters. But there's a lot of people that are very understanding of how we can move forward, how we need to do it slowly, steadily, because we don't want to move 1 step forward and then 10 steps back, because that will put us completely back to where we started. We need to make sure that whatever we do to reopen tourism is done in a safe approach, so that we can protect people that are going to come into our area, whether it's Dumfries and Galloway, whether it's the borders, or whether it's the wider area of the Central Belt and above. So for me, it's crucial. We know that tourism probably affects Scotland more than perhaps the rest of the UK. So our focus needs to be about how do we protect jobs. So extending the furlough scheme a bit longer, for instance, in Scotland compared to England. I know that that's what Cabinet Secretary Fergus Ewan has been in talks with the Tourism Minister in Westminster.
Mm-hmm. And when you're in Dumfries, so you will be seeing tourists coming up across the border. Has that made any difference yet with the fact that England has kind of moved slightly ahead of Scotland in terms of opening things up, relaxing lockdown? Has there been a big upsurge in people coming across the border trying to see a bit of Scotland?
We haven't really seen a massive upsurge, but there's people that I know that are keeping an eye on the M74 and traffic moving from south to north at Echofechan, for instance. But we're also hearing from people that they're seeing more motorhomes and caravans and cars that are like from outside the area. So we've started to see people moving into maybe their holiday homes. We've heard reports of people coming to check their holiday homes. The local police are very in tune with what's going on, and they are responding to any calls that are made to them. But from the north of England, for instance, we're still seeing some high reproduction numbers for the coronavirus. So we've also had people contact me very, very nervous about how England have moved and maybe moved too fast. I know people are complaining that Scotland have moved too slow, but we are 3 weeks behind in the coronavirus pandemic. So I don't think Scotland's moving too slow at all. I think what we need to do is just focus on the evidence, focus on what the First Minister is saying, and make sure that we can move forward and keep moving forward so that we don't see any second wave or spikes, which will then put us right back to like a baseline of lockdown again. We don't want to see that happen.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, obviously Scotland's a big international destination as well. Lots of people from all over Europe, all over the world, in fact, come to Scotland every year. How big of an impact do you think the pandemic is going to have in the longer term? I mean, obviously there aren't a lot of flights right now, but as the kind of ability to travel to Scotland improves, do you think people will still be willing to travel, and how long do you think that kind of impact might go on for?
Well, I think it's difficult to say. I mean, I'm not an expert in these matters as well, but it's hard to say because we don't know the eventual course of the pandemic is and how long it will last, how long it will take to develop an effective vaccine, and so on. But If I were to guess, I would imagine that in the medium term, that visitors probably would want to come to Scotland, but maybe from Europe, from the rest of Europe. For instance, it's hard to imagine someone coming all the way from China or even the US as frequently to Scotland as they did before. But provided that it's possible to do so, I could certainly imagine other Europeans from Scandinavia or from France or from Belgium or so on who are interested in visiting Scotland doing so. But we're all going to have to adapt to whatever this new normal is as it continues to evolve. It's not just adapting to one set of circumstances, adapting to a series of changes of circumstances that will happen over time as we better understand the course of the virus, but also how we can most effectively respond to it.
Mm-hmm. And
can I just add
sorry, Emma.
thing?
Yes, go ahead.
For us in the south of Scotland, we're talking about tourism coming in, but there's two borders for me that I have to worry about. And one is the border at Gretna between Scotland and England, and the other one is the Larne, Belfast into Cairnryan. So when people are sailing, coming from the EU, so south of Ireland, into the north and then over. So there's going to be some obviously some worries for many people when they start to see tourists coming in through both borders that come into the South Scotland. So that's something that I'm following very, very closely with both ferry operators that are coming from Larne and Belfast, and also keeping an eye on the border at Gretna as well.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at those two borders, has there been any discussion at all about quarantine for people coming into the country? Or is that solely about people coming in by plane?
It's both, actually. It's something that I've raised with the Cabinet Secretary for Transport, and also next week it's something that's coming up with the Health Committee when Hamza Yousaf is in front of us. So the quarantine aspect is effective not just for people flying in to the country, but then the coming over, obviously sailing as well. So the quarantine aspects of the remaining in the one place for 14 days, it's going to be interesting to see how that is followed or put in place or checked upon. So that's something that I will be following up with the relevant ministers as we test these rules that are being put in place.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at the kind of wider rural economy, I mean, there's tourism obviously is a big part of that, but there's also farming. And as we were going to come on to talking a wee bit about Brexit anyway, what's been the feeling in the rural the farming sector in your area to the pandemic first of all, but then to the kind of ongoing crisis of Brexit?
Recent survey came out from the Scottish Rural College about how farmers are very concerned about Brexit. And I should add as well, though, about people coming in from borders, it's about coming out from outside the common travel area. So that's something that we need to make sure that people understand, that our common travel area does consider the south of Ireland and north as well. So I need to make it clear that I'm not going to let folk that are coming in from Dublin think that they have to quarantine for 14 days. No. But the Brexit and farming is something that is really interesting, because we're starting to see more issues around trade deals with America. That's one of the things that really concerns me. So our farmers in Scotland produce some of the best produce, the best beef, the best lamb. We've got Scotch pork that is fantastic. And so when we are following what's happening with the imports that potentially could come to us with a US trade deal, it means that our farmers will be disadvantaged in Scotland, because the welfare of our animals is paramount compared to where we are when we're looking at trade deals in America. So that's a key issue of Brexit that concerns me.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, to come back to you again, I mean, I know you're not an expert on tourism, but you are an expert on Europe. And do you have any insight into how Brexit is affecting the European view of the UK as a tourist destination?
I wouldn't necessarily say that the Brexit per se would have a direct impact on tourism, because tourism is usually about short stays, and then you could do that whether or not you're in the European Union. I think that Brexit has had a more profound impact on how people view the UK's role in the world, as I think I mentioned earlier. I think one of the most disingenuous aspects of the UK government's approach to Brexit is its attempt to pretend that there are no value implications associated with leaving the European Union. I mean, the European Union is a community of values about peace, about prosperity, about human rights. And when you leave that, you are saying those values aren't important to us anymore. And obviously that matters a lot to the other member states of the EU. First of all, that's why the EU was created, and that's why they will remain members. So I think that has had a very big impact on how the UK is perceived when it comes to politics, and thinking about the future relationship, and recognizing that even if the UK government won't admit to it, that the UK has and is changing in a way which is creating huge divergence between how the UK government has its worldview and what the European Union thinks. So that's a sad fact.
Mm-hmm. Now, this week, Anthony, we have again seen the UK government stress that it intends no extension to the transition period, which means we will be out of all EU institutions and all EU rules come December 31st if they have their way. What's been your take on that story as it's kind of developed? The kind of stronger language coming from the EU itself. Germany briefing people that it's time to start preparing for no deal again. Do you think that there is still any room for manoeuvre?
Well, both sides are still saying that it's possible to have a deal without an extension in time. Maybe that is possible. I'm very skeptical of it because there's just so little time. I think one of the most interesting remarks the UK government minister has made about this was Penny Mordaunt in the House of Commons several weeks back, saying we can't keep negotiating forever, and that has no relationship with reality. I mean, these future relationship negotiations only began in March, 3 months ago, and they've been disrupted by coronavirus. There have only been 4 negotiating rounds, and so the negotiations have barely begun, and it was always a long shot to complete everything in only 11 months. That's the amount of time that was left with all the extensions of the Article 50 process, which ate into the original transition period. And it's very clear that, despite whatever diplomatic niceties there are or aren't, that those 4 rounds have made basically no progress. And that is due to the UK government's approach. Of course, the EU will look out for its own interests. I mean, that's what it's supposed to do. That would be odd if the EU just said, yeah, sure, you can cherry pick whatever you want from the single market and, have the kind of trade deal that you like, with accepting all the benefits and taking none of the responsibilities. That would be extremely odd. Yet that seems to be the UK government's approach. So no, it's a very pessimistic picture. And indeed, maybe a deal could be done in time for the end of December, but it might not be a very good deal. It might be a very bare bones one, not least as the UK government have recently said that they are willing to give up the ambition of having a zero tariff, zero quota free trade agreement in exchange for not having to commit to the level playing field. But the European Union have said even if we drop the ambition of having no tariffs and no quotas, that we will still insist on the level playing field because the UK obviously is a large economy on the EU's doorstep, and the EU will want to make sure that if the UK has good access to the single market, that it needs to follow standards which should be agreed between both sides. It shouldn't be much of an issue if the UK and the EU can follow the same high environmental standards, for instance, unless the UK government intends to drop those standards.
Mm-hmm. And when you just for my own enlightenment as well as our viewers, what does happen on December 31st or January 1st, I guess, if there isn't a deal agreed before the end of the year?
Well, the UK is already out of the European Union. I think that should be obvious to people, but it's important to say that. So it's not as if the UK is still in the EU and will be leaving. The UK is out and has a special relationship which, frankly, it should be grateful for, that the EU is willing to do this transition period, to go around to the world and say, can we still treat the UK as if it's still in the EU? And most of the world just said, sure, we'll do that. But anyway, so yes, if there's no agreement, everyone talks about trade, and trade is important. The default is World Trade Organization rules, which means whatever tariffs and quotas are under that for goods, for services, it'd be very minimal in terms of the UK's access into the EU single market. And that's critical because services is a huge proportion of the Scottish and UK economy. But of course, we need to think about much more than trade. It's everything, about energy cooperation, about aviation, about defense and security. And on all of those areas, unless there's any kind of agreement, then EU-UK cooperation just falls away. Now, in preparation for a no-deal Brexit, in terms of a no-withdrawal deal Brexit back in the day, the EU did extensive planning. It set out a number of contingency measures, including what it called preserving basic connectivity. So that was to still allow some planes to fly and still allow some lorries to travel and so on. But that was limited, it was temporary, and it was entirely for the EU's benefit rather than the UK's. So we may see that kind of preparation again, particularly if a no-deal outcome is more likely. But again, that will be at the EU's discretion based on what it thinks is best for EU interests and for EU citizens living in the UK. I suppose another thing to mention as well, that even if there is a no deal, in terms of a no deal now, the EU will still expect the UK to honour all its obligations under the withdrawal agreement. I mean, that's an international treaty which has been signed and ratified. So to still pay its residual financial contributions, to still uphold EU citizens' rights in the UK, and to still honour the compromise on Northern Ireland.
Mm-hmm. So Emma, this week the EU Continuity Bill was published, which is in large part about kind of maintaining environmental standards, maintaining that level playing field with the EU, and being able to put EU law into Scots law. How has that kind of bill been progressing through Parliament, and what's been the kind of feeling in Parliament as you're doing this? Is there a concern that no deal is now a likely prospect?
Yes. Michael Russell made a statement to Parliament on Thursday, and I'm attending Parliament remotely at the moment, so it's interesting to catch up on what's been presented. But Anthony makes a good point about how right now we are out of Europe, but we're in a transition process, and that's why folk are saying, "Oh, everything's fine, nothing's different, we're going to be fine." It's like, yeah, but the deal hasn't been done yet, and there's going to be real issues that we've heard, real complex issues, and the training of people to check produce as it comes in through the border is going to cost more than the actual membership for the EU in the first place. So the new bill that's going forward is to make sure that we keep pace with any EU changes, any changes in regulations, so that Scotland can meet environmental standards, environmental protection, so that we get ready, so for when we become independent, that when we can choose to join the EU again, that we will already be meeting the EU laws, especially with respect to the environment, so that it's easier for us to rejoin if that's when we put it to the people, if that's what they choose. So I am keen to make sure that we continue with the way that we move forward, to make sure that we keep pace with EU law, so that Scotland has, I guess, an easier approach to joining the bloc in the future.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at when you look at that possible relationship with the EU, has much thought been given to Scotland kind of trying to achieve its own kind of arrangements with the EU, given that Scotland is going to be kind of sticking with EU standards where the UK might be willing to diverge? Has there been any discussion about an independent relationship even within the UK for the time being?
I don't know of specific discussions personally, but I'm sure there's discussions that are happening. We know that the First Minister's visits to Europe to try and build relationships with the leaders is something that is happening. We know our Minister Ivan McKee has been out looking at ensuring trade is something that's really continues at the best way for Scotland. We need to make sure that Scotland's voice is heard separately from the Westminster message, because we need to make sure that the progressive approach that the Scottish Government wants in all aspects of society, that Scotland seem to be moving towards a more progressive European Scandinavian approach compared to England gravitating towards a Trumpian type of world. And so if we in Scotland in Parliament can convince folks out there that the progressive, fair, equal culture and society that we want is to gravitate towards a more European attitudes, that's what we need to continue to pursue.
Mm-hmm. And Anthony, I know you have written extensively about how Scotland, if it becomes independent, could find its way back into the EU as an independent state. How much more difficult will that be if we get to the end of this year without having achieved independence, without having achieved a Brexit deal, and then the UK starts to diverge? How big of a problem is that going to be for Scotland in the future?
Well, the longer that Scotland is outside of the European Union and the more distant the relationship between Scotland as part of the UK and the European Union, the more difficult it will be, of course. So distance is a factor and time is a factor. But, joining the European Union is a process. You're right, as I wrote about in Scotland's EU Blueprint and elsewhere, it would take a couple of years. The blueprint goes into much more detail about all of that. But so it's not as if, so for instance, there's been some discussion that we need to have an independence referendum before and have it take place before the transition ends, so we could sort of still be in the EU during the transition period, as it were. And that it's important to be as close to the EU as possible, but that really doesn't make as much of a difference. If it takes 4 years or 5 years to join the European Union, if you spend 6 months in the transition, for instance, and 4.5 years outside the EU, that really doesn't matter as much. What matters more is the extent to which Scotland, through the Scottish Parliament, through this new EU continuity bill, is able to maintain its pace with EU laws and policies for a multitude of reasons. One is to make it easier to rejoin the EU under independence, and the other is of course because it's a policy that we believe in terms of having high environmental standards, in terms of caring about workers' rights and so on, which is an important aspect of what the European Union is there to do. But I think, as Mike Russell has mentioned, it's to align where practical, because there will be some aspects where Scotland may well want to follow EU policies, but by the nature of devolution or by still being part of the UK, it just won't work. And in those areas, obviously, it won't be possible to keep pace, and that additional work will have to be done in terms of trying to rejoin the EU.
Sure. And Emma, today we saw a poll showing a near record high for yes in an independence poll, 54% to 46%. Once don't knows were removed. This has been a pretty consistent rise over the last couple of months. It's only up 4 or 5 points, but that's really all it needed to be to establish a pretty good lead. What's your feeling about where the independence movement stands right now?
Well, you're right to note this consistent rise. For me, in the area in the south of Scotland, we've got 3 Conservative MPs, we've got Conservative MSPs, and I'm even hearing from Conservative voters that would normally be voting Conservative that are now saying they like the way First Ministers handled this pandemic. They like the way that Scotland is managing to connect and engage and be transparent with people. So we've got Conservative voters now that are telling me that they would be voting for independence. And I think that's really important, because my message to many of the people that I speak to is that, we will have Conservatives in an independent Scotland, but we need to make sure that we keep engaging with business, we keep engaging with the people who would be traditional Conservative voters, so that we can hear from them and listen to them and make sure that they are part of this engagement as we move forward, because we're seeing the way that UK and Scottish policies is diverging, that at some point we're going to have to see that the best way for Scotland is to be a self-determined independent country, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, that seems like a fairly excellent place to end the conversation. It has been a very quick hour. Oh, sorry. Andy, sorry, I should just come to you. What do you think the EU's reaction will be if another independence referendum is called? Do you think they'll be a little bit more supportive this time around?
Well, I think that the EU will try its best to say nothing, which will be different from 2014, where the EU institutions, particularly the European Commission, said things which suited the UK government's position but weren't necessarily true. The famous Barroso quotes about how long it would take to join the EU and so on. Those things were never true. Now, and obviously, this time around, the EU won't be saying that, but they'll be trying not to say anything because this is what they perceive as an internal matter of what is now a third country. So, no, the EU will try to stay out of it as much as possible, and I think that's fine. Obviously, the campaign will happen in Scotland, the decision will be taken in Scotland, and then the EU will be neutral. And then if independence happens, then apply to join the European Union, and that will the response to that, I think, would be very positive.
Sure. Okay. Well, if people want to hear more from you, Anthony, I understand you are launching a podcast. Would you like to tell people quickly about that?
Yes, I would. So yes, European Merchants is launching a new podcast, eminently titled Euro Merchant Podcast, focusing on Scottish, EU and international politics, hopefully launching today. You can find that on merchants.scot, and the inaugural episode will be about the UN Security Council election that took place this past week, and the implications for Scotland, what Scotland can learn from Ireland, Norway and Canada, who are contesting the seats available.
Well, that sounds fascinating, and I do hope you will come back and talk to us about some of these issues and more in future. So thank you very much to Anthony and to Emma as well. It's been a pleasure talking to both of you, and thank you at home for joining us as well. The whole point of the shows is to have an audience for them, and so you're an integral part of making these shows a success. If you would like to support us, then please do go to broadcastingscotland.scot/register and sign up as a supporter there. Your £5 a month makes a big difference. That's all the money that we have. This is where our whole budget comes from, your donations. So if you want us to keep the lights on here, keep the shows coming, then you do have to sometimes reach into your pocket. If you can't, though, we do understand. We know times are tough for a lot of people, even at the best of times, never mind in the middle of this pandemic. So you can still help us out, though. Follow us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, or on Facebook, facebook.com/BroadcastScot, or if you're on the app, just search Broadcasting Scotland. And then share the programs around with people. You are our marketing team, and if you tell people why you watch Broadcasting Scotland, that's going to mean a lot more to them than us trying to just send them an advert that we can't even afford to pay for. And finally, if you'd like to get involved here at Broadcasting Scotland, there is lots of work to be done. Just producing these shows is a big job. So if you have any skills behind a camera or in front of a camera, or you'd like to learn some skills behind or in front of the camera, then do please get in touch with us. We would love to have you, and we will definitely find work for you. There is lots to keep you busy here at Broadcasting Scotland. But that is absolutely all we've got time for. So once again, I'd like to thank Anthony Salamone and Emma Harper, MSP. We will be back, Gordon will be back tomorrow at 7 with Scotland at 7. I'll be back on Tuesday in my usual slot. So until then, have a wonderful Sunday. Goodbye.